This session is relationships, boundaries, and communication. We're presenting Hala. I've been in private practice for about 15 years, specializing in trauma. Specifically, somatic experiencing is my training outside of my clinical training, which is a body-based psychotherapy that addresses how trauma lives in the nervous system. And for like the last 8 or 9 years, I've been working mostly with providers like you, which I really love to do, supporting folks who are the caretakers to be trauma informed for ourselves, right? So taking care of ourselves so we can offer to our students and our clients and our communities the care that we're meant to offer. What I find is that those of us who are sort of wired to care for others, it's an edge for us to care for ourselves. So this series has been really focused on tools for you all to be reflecting on your own well-being, your own sustainability, which I also think is an important part of doing our job well. If we're burnt out and resentful, we're going to take it out on our clients, our students, our colleagues, our families. Nobody benefits from you burning out. I'm originally from Beirut, Lebanon. We moved to the United States when I was 3. So my roots are in trauma, right? And so I think that like my soul has always and continues to yearn to understand how we can heal our traumas and be well together. A lot of my work was developed with system impacted youth, working in the juvenile halls here in Los Angeles, and fusing this trauma work in with yoga. I've taught yoga for a lot of my life, and I find that yoga can be an incredible way to build community, share these tools, support people in building their own resilience. And I'm really interested in their intersections of trauma and social justice. We cannot separate the two out because social injustice is traumatizing. I am raising multiracial, multi-ethnic kids. I have 2 young boys. And I think that's all I have to say by way of introducing myself right now. So, as we move through these workshops, if this is your first one with me, you'll see that I try to make them as experiential as possible. So if you can really create a space for yourself to be present, you'll get a lot more out of it. I know folks are busy, and I'm probably sitting on someone's kitchen counter while they're chopping dinner. And, some of you are driving, some of you are doing like 27 other things, right? If you're like I am when I take workshops. But I do want to push you a little to see if you actually could, if you can, right? Like close the browser, put the thing down, to give yourself that gift, right? To give yourself that gift. And again, I know we don't all have the space for that, but if you can, I want to invite you to try to engage in the material and slow down a little bit. I purposely don't pack this with tons of information. I mean, I'm kind of lying. There's tons of information, but I try to move slow because this work has to sink into our bones and our breath and our hearts and our souls. And you all deserve this because you spend your day caring for others. Most of you do, I'm assuming, if you're here and you're part of this network. And what happens to those of us wired that way is it's really hard to slow down and focus on ourselves. So I'm saying this, just to invite you, if you have the space to turn your phone off or put it a few feet away from you or create space for yourself, please do. And even if you can just do it for the first 10 minutes to get some breath into your body, join me that way. And as we move into today's session, I want to bring in this idea of relationships, right? Boundaries, communication. And as I say these words, relationships, boundaries, communication, I'm curious about what emerges for you. Any sensation in your body? Does like your heart beat a little faster? Does your gut get tight? Do you feel more relaxed? Relationships, boundaries, communication. Any associations you have? Today is our 3rd session, right? The first 2 sessions, we've really talked about our own nervous systems, right? Our own ability to regulate ourselves, what's going on inside of us. this extension of who we are, right? We are relational beings. So if we're talking about our well-being, we can't just be talking about our own individual reality, okay? So today we're going to explore the difference between codependency and healthy attachment. We're going to learn about the role of transference and countertransference in our work. We're going to talk about self-regulation. Sorry, that's a typo. Self-regulation as the foundation of effective communication. And we're going to start to tap into this idea of mirroring and active listening as a tool for healthy communication. And that's going to be something we really hopefully get to practice a little bit this session, and we'll definitely get to practice in our next session. What are some of the difference between a codependent relationship and an interdependent relationship? And what I'm going to really try to impress upon all of us as I'm sharing today is try to push back against this myth of individual well-being and this hyper individualism that I think is a problem. This idea that, like, you got to love yourself first because then nobody can love you. I think that's an awful sentiment, right? That's an awful sentiment. We learn love in relationship, right? So this is this balance of, yes, we got to love ourselves, and we have to figure out how to be in relationships and be messy, right? And recover. So this first slide has some important distinctions, and then I'm gonna complicate it a little bit, right? So codependence, right? We've heard this word, oh, we don't want to be codependent, right? So codependent relationships are typically ones where there aren't really great boundaries, right? Very poor boundaries. They're not set, they're not maintained. We often feel a sense of guilt or shame for not meeting the expectation of the other person, right? We don't have our own personal interests or goals outside of that relationship. We depend on them for our happiness and validation, right? It's like, if that person is not happy with me, then I have no self-worth, right? This is really disempowering, right? This codependence. There's emotional manipulation, right? You make them feel guilty when they disagree with you, right? We're trying to, like, in codependent relationship, we're like, trying to manipulate the other person to meet our needs. And there's a lot of control. And this can show up in lots of different ways, right? So just notice what happens in your body as you read these, right? Maybe you're like, oh God, I've got some relationships that have these qualities, right? And they don't feel good. They don't feel life affirming, right? And interdependent relationships, right? Which implies that we still depend on one another, right? It's not about, oh, I'm so independent, I don't need anybody, right? That's also not healthy, right? We need people. We are social. Independent relationships, there's healthy boundaries, right? You can set a boundary, it's respected, right? We don't have unrealistic expectations. We're often sold this story. I think this is changing, but that, like, someone will come and save you. I always joke that so many of these love songs and romantic TV shows or movies are all about codependence. Like, I need you, I would die without you, right? You complete me, right? I think some of this stuff is changing, but we're often sold this idea of love, right, or care that's actually codependence. And this is not just about romantic relationships, right? This is about friendships. This is about all kinds of relationships, right? This idea that we don't want to depend on others to feel worthy or happy. And again, I'm going to complicate this because I think that we do depend on others, right? But what's the healthy way to depend on people, right? Not in a way that gives away all your power, but in a way that recognizes that we need each other, right? In an interdependent relationship, the other person has enough space to maintain their own sense of self. And we respect their choices and opinions, even if they're different, right? So interdependent relationships, people can have different opinions. And hopefully you can see here some of the differences between these two. And I want to pause for a moment, and I'm going to keep the slide up, and I think you can do this too. I'm going to make it so I'm looking at all your faces. So if you don't want to be looking at the slide necessarily, you can maneuver your screen to be seeing more of the faces. And I just want to pause to hear from you. You can type into the chat to see, like, what do you think of this list? Does it resonate, or are there some you want to push back against that you're like, no, like, or I want to add something to this list, or I don't think this should be under this. Any thoughts or opinions or pushback or affirmations? And you can hit the raise hand icon and speak or type it into the chat. And, for me, growing up in a culture that's very tribal, I'm from Lebanon. And so it's all about like everything is enmeshed, right? Like we're a very tribal culture and you're not supposed to really have a sense of self and you're always with your family. My mom would get insulted if I was too independent, if I didn't need her, right? It was like a affront to her existence, right? So there's a lot of cultural parts to this, right? Versus cultures that are a little bit more individualistic. And I think that both extremes are unhealthy, right? Both extremes are unhealthy. That if it's all about the individual, then there's this loss of connection to community. And if it's all about the community, there could be a loss of self, right? This is why I like the word interdependence, because it implies that it's both, right? It's something in between. The individual is honored, but we see ourselves as part of a community. And so again, we're all going to have different things to work with. Like in my culture, you don't kick your kid out at 18, like I remember we came to the US and like some people would be like, oh, at 18, they have to leave. Like in my culture, you live with your parents until you get married or whatever, right? It's a different, and then they move in with you because you take care of them, right? So we're always together in community. And there's beauty to that. And there's also can be some limitations to that. So, as we're reflecting on, okay, let's start to reflect on the different relationships we have, right? And part of what I want you all to start thinking about is like an inventory of like, what are the different relationships that you have? And where is there a lot of health in those relationships? And where are there things that you might want to shift and change? Okay. So now what I want to add to this analysis or to this, this sort of dichotomy is I want to weave in power. Okay. So for example, if you look at this list, but we're thinking about a baby and the parent, right? Well, babies, they depend on the parents for all their needs, right? Babies need you to meet all their needs right away. Like, it's not like, oh, I'm codependent with my baby, I'm not going to like pick them up when they cry, right? Then I want you to also think about, what if you're thinking about your relationship with your boss? Oh, now we're bringing power into it, right? Your relationship with your boss. Is it maybe your boss has the power to fire you, right? There is a dependence. If your boss is upset with you, they could fire you and your well-being is kind of in their hands, right? That's not because you're codependent. That's because there's a power dynamic that gives that person a lot more power. So when we add power into this mix, it complicates this dichotomy. And I want to bring this up right now. So as you're reflecting on your own relationships, we start to think about the role of power in healthy relationships, because relationships are one source of potential anxiety for you, as well as a source of healing. We want to have a sort of a proper analysis of the expectation, right? So you're not going to necessarily say you're somebody's boss, right? And you have the power to fire them. You have a lot of power over them. Do you expect them to meet your emotional needs, right? Do you expect them to like be listening to your problems, right? Expectations are different based on the situation and based on the power. Power dynamics can be attributed to two things. Okay. First, it could be the role that you're in. Okay. So if you're the therapist, you have more power than your client, right? They're the ones sharing all their vulnerable information with you. You know all about them. They probably don't know that much about you necessarily, right? If you're a manager and you're dealing with staff, you have more power, right? Or a supervisor, whatever the different roles are you're in, right? If you're a parent and dealing with your children, your teacher and student, sorry, I didn't put teacher student on there. Apologies for that, right? So in some of your relationships, you're in the power position, and some you are not, right? Now, power is not always about role. It can also be about your identity and maybe some of the historical and current dynamics around our identities. So we're talking about gender, right? Race. We can think about neurodiversity, right? So if you're a neurotypical person speaking to a neurodivergent person, the world is oriented to neurotypical people, right? Our brains, assumptions about social interactions, right? So folks who are neurodivergent, say autistic folks, right? Maybe they read social cues differently, or they give different social cues. Oftentimes autistic folks have to do what's called masking, right? To try to fit into the social order, right? And that's exhausting, right? And they're going to be at a disadvantage. Class, right? So we can complicate it because it's like, okay, what if you're like a woman and you're the boss of a man, right? So structurally you have power, but historically and based on your identity, you don't, right? So power dynamics can be complicated, right? And sometimes they're very, very clear, right? Sometimes your identity is in the power position and the role you're in is in the power position. And all of those things impact expectations, accountability, and dynamics in relationships. Okay. And so, I bring this up because some of you might be experiencing stress in relationships because you're in a relationship where you have less power, right? And that can be very stressful, right? If that other person isn't communicating well, is unclear, is abusive, right? That's stressful. But here's the other thing I want to say too is you can also be stressed because you are causing harm in relationships. Maybe there's relationships where you have the power, where you might be unconsciously causing harm or not aware. And this is something I like to bring in because there's a term, this comes from the veteran community called moral injury. And it has to do with the stress and trauma that many veterans experience, not based on things they saw or that were done to them, but things they did, right? Moral injuries when you do something that's against your own morality, right? Now, as like a therapist or a supervisor, this is different. You're not like, killing people, right? But you might be unconsciously knowing that you might be causing harm, right? You might be perpetuating harm in somebody else. And that's also going to cause harm to you. And it's always really important for me to bring this level of accountability in because oftentimes, but if we're really going to change things, we also want to reflect on our own accountability and the ways that we might be causing harm and unaware of it or aware of it, but not knowing how we would change it or feeling afraid to take accountability for it or being stuck in a system that kind of makes us cause harm, right? It's like if you're stuck in that system and you don't feel like you can change it. So what I want to do now is invite you to reflect on some of the relationships in your life. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to write, what are the main relationships that you are in? And think about the various interactions that you have, personal, work-related. You could name the people, or you could say like parent, child, therapist, client. But if there's specific relationships that are really present for you right now, relationships where maybe you're struggling or you're feeling stressed or confused, relationships that are draining, as well as relationships that are very affirming and positive. Once you make your list, then I want you to underline the ones where there are unequal power dynamics and then circle the person with more power, or write it's complicated, right? It's not always a binary. And then as you're looking at this list, here's the reflection. What is the most salient issue for you in relationships right now? Is it boundaries? Is it speaking your truth? Is it listening? What else? Like, I just want to sort of unearth what's present for all of you right now so that you're aware of what you want to focus on as we're talking about relationships. Oh, I like this. Somebody said to add to the interdependent, finding joy in being together. Yeah. And I would add that it's life affirming, right? So those are life affirming relationships. Yeah. And again, what are the most salient issues for you? And, the other thing I really want to bring into this space or amplify again is this, this myth of individual well-being that we have been sold, like, just, take care of yourself, and then you should be happy and you shouldn't need anybody. And the shame we can feel when we think we need people, right? I'm seeing here this comment. I love my independence despite my physical disability. My spouse and siblings sometimes want to highlight what they think I cannot do. It may take longer for me, but I get it done. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for that share, right? And so that balance between dependence and independence, right? The way the world views us, the way that the larger systems care for us or don't care for us, right? So for disabled folks, there's this larger systemic thing, but not wanting to internalize that, right? Um, but also this hyper individuality that I'm gonna assume many of us face if we're in the United States, right? This messaging of you're supposed to be fine. We have to, and even the individuality of the nuclear family. So this isn't even about the individual person, but for those of you who have children or partners and children, there is this nuclear family thing that is very, very harmful to families because we cannot do this alone, right? Some of you talked about your role as parents. There's a really beautiful book, and I'll try to remember to add this to the resources, by Mia Mingus, called How We Connect. And she talks about queering relationships. And what she means by that is that queer folk for a long time had to redefine relationship because the world did not recognize their relationships. So folks were polyamorous, or they were like best friends, but then had lovers, or were lovers, but people taking care of each other's children, taking care for each other. And in general, marginalized people and people that are targeted by our larger systems have had to figure out how to care for one another because the systems aren't caring for them. And so they have these relationships that do not fit into a nuclear family, right? If you look at the Black community who's been targeted by obviously racism and mass incarceration, oftentimes you see that what do folks do? Grandmas are raising the kids, right? That people get crafty. They figure out how to care for one another outside the box. But what happens if you live in a body that is pathologized is it gets seen as pathologized, right? Like, so Black child being raised by the grandmother is seen like, oh, you don't have family, right? Or you're not being taken care of by your two, heterosexual parents, right? So I want to invite you all to reflect on even your own upbringing, and is the way that you were brought up pathologized by the larger structures, right? And did you internalize that? And maybe it was actually quite rad, quite amazing, right? Or resourceful, right? Or all of it. Yeah, kinship. Thank you, Jamie. And it's normal, right? And Mia Mingus talks a lot about this. And it's something so many folks have lost, right? She also talks about allowing ourselves to depend on each other more. And that's what allows friendships to go to the next level of depth. She tells a story about a friend of hers who was diabetic. And she never really knew much about her process, right? She kind of had her insulin and did her thing. And finally, one day she said, sit me down, give me your doctor phone numbers. What happens if there's an emergency? And she ended up having an app on her phone that would help track her friend's blood sugar, right? It's like, why don't we let ourselves go to this level of intimacy in friendships, right? Only in romantic relationships or with blood family. And also what might be called codependent, right? This is why I have a love-hate relationship with the word codependence, because as somebody who, I was born on July 4th, I'm like Miss Independence. Like, I don't want, I remember when my college essay was all about how we're born alone and we die alone. Like, I had this whole thing about being alone, right? And I remember my dad read it and he like wept. He's like, you're not alone. I was like, I'm alone. I can do it by myself, right? So I know for me it's vulnerable to admit that I need other people because I'm way better by myself. I'm a control freak. I like doing it all exactly my way. But I got to tell you something. When I'm doing it all my way, my anxiety is not any less, right? I'm just in control in a way that's still very rigid and grasping, right? So we all have different edges in relationship. And in session 2, we talked about developmental trauma, right? That if in your family of origin, you did not get consistent attunement, you did not get consistent warmth from your caretakers, that imprint is, the imprints, both imprints, the positive one and the not positive one, get carried with us into adulthood, right? So we're all working our shit out, like nobody is exempt, right? But especially for folks who would reflect and say, you know what, I think actually one of my traumas is developmental trauma, right? I did not get attunement, I did not get warmth. That's going to be especially an edge to try to figure out what are your boundaries and what are your needs in relationships. So just track your bodies as we're talking about this right now. For some of you, this might be a really painful, difficult topic. For some of you, very exciting, right? Just notice what's there for you, right? Notice what's present. And what I want to do is pivot and focus a little bit right now on your professional relationships, although this is going to all filter into your personal, right? So how many of you identify as folks who are holding space for others in some way or another throughout your day? You can hit the raise hand icon. So therapists, teachers, supervisors, managers, that it is your job to hold space for other people. You might also be doing it just in your role because it's your personality, but how many of you is it also an expectation in your job, right? Holding space for others. Yeah. So a lot of you are raising your hands for that, right? And then some of you, it might not be the expectation in your job, but you find yourself in that role, right? So for me, even in high school, I was everybody's therapist. I was my parents' therapist. I was my friend's therapist. I only knew how to be in a relationship if people needed me. And I unconsciously, I kind of figured, well, if they don't need me, why would they're going to leave me? Like why would they be interested in being in a relationship with me if I can't help them? Right? That's what I thought relationships were. I thought relationships were when you help people. And I had a stomachache all the time because I was never helping enough and everybody needed me. And there was nobody I could turn to when I was feeling vulnerable. And I remember when I really started to change that and I was like, you know what? And then I remember when I was just so exhausted, so depleted, and I started hating people because it was like, if people were just a burden, right? Like, I don't want to be around anybody, right? Um, and then I was like, you know what? I'm only going to be in this role if I'm getting paid. And then I became a therapist, right? And in any of my relationships that are not my professional relationships, they have to be reciprocal. I have to sometimes be supporting them, and then they need to be supporting me, right? So I feel like now, and I remember the first time I really made a friend that was my equal. It was very intimidating. I still remember I moved to LA and I was doing capoeira. Capoeira is a Brazilian martial art I love, right? I started taking capoeira and I was terrible at it. And there was this girl, Tessa. She was like the cool girl. She was great at capoeira. She was beautiful. She was smart. She was a social justice activist. And I was like, oh my God. And I felt like the kid in school, like, I was never a popular kid at school. So I went back to high school. And then we eventually became friends and she's now like my best friend. But I remember being really clear, like, this is different. This person does not need me, right? This person loves me, even though she doesn't need me. What a concept, right? I didn't really know that in my body and in my heart. I only knew that people love me if they need me, right? Our need to be needed. That can be really helpful. And we can examine how that shows up professionally, how that shows up personally. And it can allow us to be a lot more sustainable, right? And how we're using our energy, right? Is that resonating? I'm seeing some nods and comments. Yeah. I'm really grateful for the few of you have your cameras on because it really helps me to know folks are listening. And I understand others can't, but again, we are relational beings, right? So it's like, oh yeah, somebody's out there, right? I always ask when we do these, please don't make it a webinar where I'm just staring at myself because it's so awful. Although my hair looks good today, so I'm okay staring at myself. I'm going to pause for a moment because I'm seeing some chats come up. How do you share power in work relationships? Like, how do you empower your client, manager, or employee? I love that question, Taylor. And I think that let's chew on that, right? Because we think that that's to just assume that one person has power and one person doesn't is a limited belief, right? So how do we acknowledge the inherent power differences that just exist? And then what does it mean to push against them, right? When is it sort of healthy to have a different power dynamic, right? Sometimes it's important to say, I got your back, like I got it, right? Or this is just the nature of it. We have to acknowledge that. I remember, so I taught yoga for a really long time. I still do, but I remember when I was doing my training, my teacher sat and watched me teach, and she took like 5 pages of notes. It was very intimidating. And her main reflection to me was, why are you so self-deprecating? Like, I would get up to teach and I'd be like, I'm just like all of you. And I was always deprecating myself because I did not want my students to feel like I had more power or I thought I was better than them. Um, but what I learned was I do have the power. I'm telling people when to inhale and exhale. Like I'm inviting people to move their bodies, right? I have a lot of power, and it actually can cause harm if I don't recognize the responsibility of that role, right? So out of my own discomfort, I kept wanting to pretend like I didn't, but I was up there talking and they were on their mats moving their bodies. It was my responsibility to acknowledge the power I had and make sure I was using it responsibly and continuing to empower them, continuing to say, and this is one of the main things I do is I teach trauma informed yoga to say, lift your arm up. But if that doesn't feel good, notice what does, right? Like empowering folks to move their bodies in a way that is self-determined, right? But holding the responsibility of, and I can offer you things that are safe for your body, right? We can collaborate, and I have a particular responsibility. This is how I see myself as a therapist. I see myself as accompanying my clients. I'm not the one with all the answers. I'm not the one to tell them what to do. And especially, I got to say, my clients with the most complex trauma, the stuff that's like you're not necessarily seeing changes because just life continues to rattle them, continues to rattle them over and over again. I have a particular client who that's just her lived experience. And she left her prior therapist because she felt so much pressure to get better for the therapist that it wasn't therapeutic anymore. Right. And what she needed is somebody to accompany her in her journey, which is a very different intention. Right. And I'm not suggesting we don't want our clients to get better. We 100% do if that's their goal, right? But again, what's that balance to say, I'm holding space for you to transform and heal, and I'm not going anywhere if none of that happens. And I'm going to hold myself accountable if I need to be showing up differently. So it's complicated, right? And how do we hold that complexity in a way that is also allows us to be more sustainable in the work we're doing, right? And that can be really hard. How are we showing up? What's present for us? Okay. I want to talk about transference and countertransference. And I imagine those of you with clinical training are probably very familiar with that term. Those of you who are not clinically trained, it might be a newer term. I think it's an important one for all of us to know about, right? So transference is when we transfer onto somebody else our own unconscious material. Okay. And it might not be based on anything about them, just whatever they bring up in our psyche, right? So I might see somebody who is male presenting, and I'm going to transfer all this stuff about men. White men, I'm going to transfer them. Black man, whatever. Like we're going to transfer stuff based on race, based on body size. It's visual. It can be visual, right? It can be energetic, right? I might see somebody who like is a little more shut down, and because I'm a people pleaser, I'll think that they hate me, right? I don't have all these thoughts about who they are, right? Transference is what we put on other people that's based on our own unconscious, right? Some of what we put on them might be true about them, some of it might not, right? But it's about our own unconscious material. Okay. We're doing this all the time, right? Like, you all just met me. You probably have lots of unconscious opinions about me, right? Just based on what I've presented so far, right? And the less we know about a person, the more space there is to transfer our own biases, thoughts, assumptions, histories onto them. Again, some of it might be accurate, some of it might not. Okay. Now, let's bring in power dynamics. Okay. So if I'm transferring onto you, my ableism, right? Oh, you're disabled. That must mean XYZ, right? All the things we might say about disabled folks, right? That's my own transference. Now, what if I'm your therapist? Now I have power and I'm transferring stuff onto you, right? It is my responsibility. And the term for that, countertransference. Countertransference is just the direction of power. And I have an image of this for you visual learners. It's just the power directions. It's the same thing, but in the direction of power, right? So if you're the teacher or the therapist or the helper, right, the person with more power, What you transfer onto the client, the student, whoever else, is your counter transference. They are doing the same thing to you. That is their transference. So again, I know for some of you, this is familiar. For some of you, this is more new. So the difference in the words just has to do with the power dynamic. Now, again, power is complicated, right? So you might be in a powerful role, but your identity might be one that's historically less powerful. So it's complicated, right? But in general, the onus is on the person with more power to be dealing with their counter transference. Okay, that's your responsibility. If you're holding space for somebody, you're in a position of responsibility. You got to know your shit. You got to know what you're bringing into this relationship. Otherwise, you're going to cause harm. You're going to try to fix them and save them. You're going to pathologize them. You're going to be unsustainable, right? It doesn't help anybody. Okay. Now, they have their own transference onto you, but in general, it is not their job to deal with it, right? They are there getting your support. Now, this is especially true with a client and a therapist and a teacher and a student. Okay. Again, in some situations, it's, again, it's complicated, right? But I'm just trying to offer some framing that then we can complicate and go, yeah, but in this situation, actually, both people have to XYZ, right? And then there's those complicated dynamics, right? So I remember working with a colleague. She's a Black woman, Black trauma therapist. She had somebody in one of her trainings, a white woman, who had pretty serious mental health issues, right? Who she had to ask to leave the training because she wasn't really safe for herself and for the other people, right? Gave her a full refund. But then this person went on social media and started to say all these racist things about this Black teacher, right? So now we're like, ooh, what's going on power-wise, right? So I called my friend and I was like, we gotta come, we gotta be allies. This person's being racist. She goes, she goes, I'm fine. This person has very serious mental health issues. She was like, you don't need to come and care for me. Let's figure out how to care for this person, even though they're white, right? So there was a historical power imbalance, but in that moment, right, in the checking in, my colleague was fine, grounded, not triggered, very resourced. And we agreed we have to support this person, right? Does that make sense, right? So again, some situations are complicated, right? And then I've had colleagues who come from marginalized community who are teachers who very much get harmed by their students, like assumptions students make about them, right? I see this with like fat yoga teachers or big bodied yoga teachers. Students don't assume they're the teacher, right? And so in those moments, that person needs a lot of care, right? And it's often a complicated reflection of like, I'm their teacher and they like left class because they don't perceive me to have a yoga body, right? Or I'm the therapist, but they walked out because of my gender, my race, whatever it is, right? So again, as you are reflecting on your relationships, some of them are going to be complex. And I don't want to say to you, if you come from a targeted community and you're in the position of power, well, suck it up. You got the power, right? Because sometimes care is really making sure you get support or not working with that person, right? So, it's also up to you to sort of check in with your own well-being, right? And your own sustainability. The cheerleader, you support the others to do the work for themselves. You're like cheering them on. You have clear boundaries, right? They're on their own journey, right? Like you can't be in charge of somebody else's journey, right? And to me, the cheerleader, I have to think about as a parent as well. Especially like my adolescent, I'm like, he's on his journey now, right? You're not attached to how you're perceived. If you're doing the work because you want other people to think that you're valuable or lovable or needed, then it's not about them, it's about you, right? And it's about trusting that other person's innate wisdom and capacity, right? So these are two very different ways to show up for students, for clients, even again, if you're in a supervisor role. So this is when you're in the power role, right? As a parent, right? Being the savior never works. right? Again, once in a while, right? So once in a while it might work. But, I want to invite you to reflect on that in your own work. Do you tend to be the savior or do you tend to be the cheerleader, right? What's your edge? And what I have found in doing this work for so long is a lot of us that are drawn to this work had to be the saviors in our family of origin. We were the caretakers. And so we might have this association that, oh no, I have to save people, right? And then we have to work on, I'm gonna stay on the shore, right? Maybe I'll throw you a life raft. I'll teach you some strokes. I'll have you see that the land is right there, or that you could actually stand up if you straightened your legs, right? Versus I'm going to jump in with you. So this is both more sustainable for you because you're not taking on somebody else's fate, right? And it's empowering to them. The other way to think about this too is this idea of, are you observing or absorbing? So when you are holding space, can you really stay in your own body, in your own experience? These are all the metaphors. I love metaphors, right? To me, they help me learn, right? This is also true in our, this is part of the interdependence, right? Can we, with our loved ones, can we be there for them, but not take it on? It doesn't help them if we take it on. And then the other one is this metaphor of the seesaw. It's like relationships are like a seesaw, but if you jump off and you go to the other side, the game ends. There's no more flow. You got to stay on your side of the seesaw for there to find that flow. Jumping off doesn't do anything for anybody. So now I have some reflections for you, and now you'll have an opportunity, if you want, to go into some groups. Is, do you tend to be a savior or a cheerleader? Are you observing or absorbing? And what strengths or fears might be underlying your behavior, right? So for me, just by way of example, I think I shared with you all that we moved here from Lebanon when I was 3 because of the war. And my mom discovered when they moved here that my dad was addicted to drugs. He was a doctor. He had access to all these pills, right? But she decided she was going to stay to save him because she'd married him and it was her job to save him, and that my birth would save everybody, right? So like literally I was born into this, I will save everybody, and was always protecting my younger siblings, was always in that role of savior. And so my nervous system didn't know, like if somebody was, like when my dad was unhappy, I had to go try to manage his behavior because otherwise he'd scream at my mom or throw something, right? Like in order to keep everybody safe, I had to manage him. I couldn't just be like, oh, Dad, it looks like you're mad. I'm going to stay on my side of the seesaw. I was jumping, right? So I had to unlearn my survival behavior, right? Sometimes I like to think about, how do we move out of our survival self into our authentic self? And our survival self, like we needed that. Like that's our badass shit, right? They don't want you to feel guilty about it or bad because we had to survive. How do we transform that into something that's more sustainable and authentic and life affirming in our relationships? So I'm going to be quiet, invite you to reflect on this. And then we're going to take you all into some small groups to just share and listen. If you want to be in small groups, they're always optional. Okay. So I'm going to be quiet for a couple minutes. If you want to share stuff in the chat, please feel free to. We can only really listen and be present when we're self-regulated. And when we're really listening and we're present, then we know I got to teach right now, right? I got a role model right now. I need to be quiet right now, right? I need to offer mirroring right now. But when we are dysregulated, burnt out, triggered in our judgment, in our preconceived notions of the person, in our need to be liked, whatever our stuff is, we're not going to know what the appropriate intervention is, the appropriate words are. So this is where we come back to grounding in our own bodies, grounding in ourselves, so that we can witness that other person, and then we can make an assessment about what they need, right? So this kind of takes us full circle into these tools. And then the other piece, and this is the piece we're going to really focus on next time, but we're going to start to today, is a tool that I find to be a really incredible one, which is this tool of deep, deep listening and presence. Okay. Because whenever there's conflict, whenever, well, with conflict, especially, usually there's conflict because people don't feel heard. Right. And if they don't feel heard, they're going to get louder. Um, and sometimes it's really hard to listen to other people because they're not delivering you what they want you to hear in a very skillful manner, right? Or in the way that's really easy to hear, right? I just had it with my husband. We're trying to figure out summer camp for the kids because my kids need to be away from me because they've not left my side for 2 years, right? And I had the opportunity to go to Ecuador, and I'm like, we're sending him to Ecuador, right? And I've had this whole dream about this Ecuador trip, but he's gonna apply. And today my husband calls, he goes, you can't go to Ecuador, it's not safe. And he's like screaming all this at me, right? My husband's been out of town. And I was like, and I noticed, and I was very proud of myself. I took a breath and I said, honey, I can't hear you when you yell at me. I said, you're yelling. I hear that you're really concerned about, you feel really clear he should not go. And I'm so defensive because of the way you're delivering it to me. Is there a better way, a better time that you can talk when you can maybe help me understand your point of view? Because I was really clear, and my husband does this thing. When he starts to talk loud, I shut down and I get defensive and my ears close. I tell him, you're screaming, my ears are closing, right? And my husband's a very passionate person. He's 6'5". He used to be an actor. He can get very theatrical, right? And he gets really passionate, but it does not help me hear him, right? And on a good day, I can say, my ears are closing. I love you. I know you care about our son. But my body was like, no way, dude, we're sending him and you're being stupid. Like in my body, I did not want to hear him because he was not saying a thing I wanted to hear because it's not according to my agenda, right? So I used my tools, right? And then I did really well. I should get stars for this. He's like, it's dangerous. You know what they're doing it. I have a friend who's like stuck in these other countries, blah, blah, blah. And I get it. He's concerned, right? And I'm desperate to get my kid away from home. Basically, we have competing agendas, right? And I thought, okay, I'll just try to hear him. He's not delivering it in a way you want to hear. And I took a breath and I was like, you're really worried about Sebastian. I love how much you care about his safety. I got stars for that. And guess what? Right away, he settled down and he was like, okay, honey, well, let's talk about it. Like he just, as soon as he felt heard. Why do people scream? Because they don't feel heard, right? And my husband knows I'm a stubborn person. He knows when I get my mind set on something, no one's going to change my mind. So even before I did anything, he was yelling at me, right? So, and again, this is a situation where I'm safe. I'm not concerned I'm going to be harmed, right? Like if someone's yelling at you and you're not safe, do not mirror them. Get to safety, right? But I first had to regulate myself. And then I was able to let him know I hear him. And then guess what? He wanted to know more about my opinion, right? But I had to listen to him. So I love talking to folks about mirror. And again, this is probably not new for any of you, but here's the thing that I think is often missed. And if any of you have ever studied nonviolent communication or active listening, can you actively listen when you're in fight or flight? No, right? If you're in sympathetic arousal, if you're in shutdown, you can know, oh, I'm supposed to do this thing right now. You're not going to do it because you're not in your neocortex. You're not in your higher brain, right? You're in this primitive brain state. Your alarm bells are going on and you're just trying to figure out how to be safe or be heard. Okay. So we have to first figure out, how do I get grounded? How do I breathe? How do I regulate myself so I can listen? Because in some situations, we have to do that in order to be heard. Now, again, let's bring in power. If you are having to do that for your boss who's abusive and loud, yes, maybe sometimes it's going to be effective, but I don't want to suggest the onus is on you, right? So again, I want to be cautious when we're talking about this to also make sure it doesn't get weaponized, right? It doesn't get weaponized, that we're not asking folks who are being targeted, take a breath and breathe and try to mirror that person. So I really want to be clear here that as you are reflecting on this tool, that you're reflecting on the really appropriate times where you want to utilize it, right? Because sometimes it's about setting a boundary, not listening, getting yourself to safety. Okay. But for the purposes of this, we want to reflect on what are appropriate situations, right? So situations like working therapeutically with clients, right? Working with children, working with our students, right? Working with our staff, right? If you're managing folks, you're supervising folks, these are going to be some really important tools. So when you have the power, but also in peer relationships, right? I do it with my adolescent, my adolescent, he's 14. I'm always wrong. That's his entire reality, right? So when I say to him, listen, I told you 3 times to take out the garbage. I need you to do it. You blah, 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 blah. Like, and he's giving me all these excuses. Like, of course, I want to be like, you just listen to me. And sometimes that's appropriate. And sometimes, what gets me far? I know you had a really long day at school and you hate that you show up and I just tell you what to do. I know that's really hard. And I'm so proud of all that you're doing at school. And I really need your help. And I really need you to go take the garbage out. Right. So I offer the mirroring and then I deliver what I need. Right. So the other thing about mirroring is when people, and somebody once gave me the statistic, if they can hear 3 statements that their answer is yes, they settle. And then they can hear what you need to tell them that might not be so easy to hear, like take out the garbage after your long day at school. Right. So mirroring is not agreeing. Right. So I'm not agreeing with my son that he shouldn't do chores because he goes to school all day, right? I'm not agreeing with my son that I'm whiny and annoying. I'm just saying, this is how you feel, right? So mirroring is not agreeing. It's just letting somebody you heard them. Okay, I'm going to put up a slide for you visual folks. And it's really hard to mirror when we are not self-regulated, okay? So when we mirror somebody, we communicate verbally and non-verbally. I hear you, I see you, I don't judge you, and I'm curious about your perspective and your experience. We avoid giving advice, judging, analyzing, sympathizing. Okay. And again, this is not easy. This is not easy. But when we don't do it, like I can't guarantee this will always work to get folks to settle or to listen, right? Or to collaborate with you. But when we don't do it, things get worse. When we don't do it, things get worse because people get heightened. People get heightened. So I'm wondering, I want to give you all some examples, and I have a lot of my own, but I'm curious about situations where you think that this is really hard. I'll give you just a couple more. So I work, like when I work with teachers, oftentimes their biggest challenge is working with the parents, not even with the students at the school, right? I'm seeing some nods, right? And so like it's COVID, right? And so like, I don't know about some of you, but in some of these schools, the parents, we want the teachers to fix everything. Like our kid is stressed, right? You're the school therapist, and there could be this projection onto you of you need to make this right? Curious if folks are resonating with that, right? And it might feel like the first thing you want to do is be like, this is not my department, like to immediately try to correct them, right? Versus, okay, can you not take it on? And then just mirror back, I see that you're really overwhelmed, right? I would love actually the difference between sympathizing and empathizing, right? So it can be a little bit semantic, but like sympathizing sometimes can be about, I'm going to jump in with you, right? I'm going to jump in with you. I'm going to feel sorry for you, right? What does that do? Oh, it says you can't handle it, versus I'm going to stay on my side of the seesaw and go, that sounds like that's really hard. Seems like you're really overwhelmed and you're really concerned, right? We're trying to offer mirroring responses. Now, the thing with mirroring is you have to do it with your tone to be like, oh, it sounds like that really upset you, right? Like that's obnoxious, right? And like, it doesn't work. You have to like really try to empathize, even if their position is the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard. Right. I had to do this a lot when my kids were toddlers because toddlers are ridiculous, right? Like my son had a meltdown because I wouldn't let him take the vegetable juicer in his bed with a 1-pound bag of carrots. I still remember he wants to carry it all, put it in his bed. That's a ridiculous thing to want, right? But it doesn't matter. I had to sit with him as he's crying, and I had to be like, you really wanted to take the carrots into your bed, and you wanted to make juice in your bed, right? And that seems really fun, but you can't do that, right? I had to like metaphorically get in there with him, right? But not energetically, to then offer the mirroring. I want you to all like try to give me your most difficult situation. Not that I'm good, like I might fail and then you can mirror back to me that like I failed, right? But situations where you're like, I don't see it. How would I mirror? Okay. So this is a really great point, right? So if something is happening in a room that is a replication of the larger systems of domination and a replication of the harm that folks are used to experiencing, we want to interrupt it, right? So how do we, especially if those folks are in the room, but even if they're not in the room, right? So how do we skillfully find a way to disrupt that? And then how do we skillfully find a way to like privately try to use mirroring to support that person to move out of it, right? So I think, and I would love folks to jump in, I think that there's the way that in the larger space, we say like, listen, this is harmful rhetoric. If there's other Asian or Chinese people in the room saying there's people in the room that are going to be impacted by this rhetoric, we will talk about this in private. And again, depending on the age, there's so many caveats, right? So how do we disrupt dynamics? And then when do we appropriately use mirroring to try to usher that person into a different understanding? I could imagine situations where we could skillfully use a mirroring of like, listen, it sounds like you're really trying to figure out where this virus came from. And it can feel really easy to think that it was like this plot, right? And you probably got that information. And can you see the ways that this perpetuates racism? So again, I think that it depends is how old are these kids? What kind of information do they have? Who else is in the room? You know what I mean? Like the thing that I always want to say is like, if there's somebody in the room who's constantly that target, I'm going to do the intervention that includes them, that doesn't put them back in that position, right? Just because like, to me, that's justice, right? Justice is I'm going to make all the non-Asians in the room feel uncomfortable in this moment where Asians are being targeted, right? Or I'm going to let the white folks sit in their discomfort so that the one or two people of color don't have to, right? To me, that's justice. And it's also my identity, right? So if I'm being read as white or I'm not Asian, like I've been with skillful Black facilitators who are calling Black folks out on things in a way really skillfully, but there's a safety because they have a shared identity. The public facing is you're disrupting the behavior. You are naming, this is harmful, this is what it does. The private is more the softer mirroring you don't like that. The person who's harmed does not have to be and watch you sort of have empathy and curiosity. They don't need to watch that part. The best way for folks to learn is through that empathy, right? Like you said, you're not going to like scream at somebody and then they stop being racist. But what happens, this is what happens, is the dominant group will often, their feelings will get centered in group spaces, right? So we want to disrupt that, right? We don't want to center their education and their learning, but we still want to find spaces to get them that education and learning, not at the expense of targeted folks in the room. So part of justice is like not centering dominant folks. And I want to say that, in my humble opinion, the better, the more skillful we get at being with conflict or difference without losing our center, again, the less stressful or anxiety provoking conversations can be or relationships can be. That how can we figure out to be in the messiness together, right? To mess up and rebound together, to not have unrealistic expectations of others and ourselves. Relationships are messy, right? So we have one more session in this series, okay? So this is going to be our next one. So what's next, right? So next session is the practice, the self-reflection, and the intention setting that we'll do together.
All right, so of course we do also offer the continuing education hours, 2 for each session, for a total of all the sessions. And you could go ahead and just email us if you'd like to apply. We have a lot of events that we post as well as research and articles, things like that.